Welcome to A New Capitalism, the podcast that will show you how you can invest your money to help create a more just and prosperous economy for all. Here's Frank Altman.
I'm back with Kimberlee Cornett. We've been discussing her remarkable career in community development, impact investing, and housing finance. And now, Kimberlee, I want to get into your work as the Senior Director of Impact Investments at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I write in my book about the role of environmental, social, and governance, known as ESG investing. Could you explain the concept of social determinants of health and the types of investments organizations are making outside of healthcare to address factors contributing to poor health?
I can remember long ago when I was in the tax credit business, my boss had a bumper sticker and it said, "Housing is healthcare." And that seemed kind of like something that like a 60s hippie said, which he was. But we actually know today by the data that housing is healthcare. And we know that there are other social determinants of health: where you live, where you work, where you play, what your education is English your first language. Those things all are determinants of your health. And so I think, Frank, and you have seen it from your side of the table as well, a real forceful attempt to really change the conditions in communities to address some of the barriers that stand between individuals realizing their fullest, and healthiest life possible. So in some of our investments, I'm thinking most recently of an investment that the foundation made alongside of United Healthcare in a fund called Invest Appalachia. So this was a really intentional effort to get capital into a really hard to serve area of the country, and not just debt, but really thinking more about equity, the kind of capital that really needs to sit and create a foundation for businesses and housing to thrive. And that investment, took several years, to create. They're not easy when you're dealing in communities with limited income, limited track record of taking and repaying capital. But that's one that we're particularly proud of because of kind of the not homogenous group of investors that has come around that investment. I think another one that I really enjoyed, and this is a number of years ago, was the Strong Families Fund. It was actually when I first came to really know RWJ. So an organization called Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future had really taken a very data-driven approach to collecting information about the delivery of social services in affordable housing projects. And so, something I learned in that is that this concept of dosage, so whether a kid goes to after-school tutoring once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, those things really make a difference. And if you're not delivering services at a dosage level that is high enough, you're really limiting the effectiveness. Now, there's lots of reasons that those services don't go, and primarily because we don't always naturally have a payer for them. But SAFE went very far down the road, really trying to develop kind of a taxonomy of what works in social services. And with that, we raised a fund that was invested in by Goldman Sachs and KeyBank. And we took a slice of the equity that is normally funded within the transaction, and we substituted it with a guarantee. And the reason that we did that is because we wanted to create additional resources for the developer to use to fund those social service programs. And as the effectiveness of the service delivery went up, the developer was able to kind of earn an incentive payment, for the easiest way to describe it. That incentive payment was provided by a very large grant that came from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And it was really the first time that we had tried to develop and deliver services with kind of a uniform delivery methodology. And that's difficult to do. But in pay-for-performance structures, you really do need the consistency of the delivery to really understand what is working. And I'm really proud to say that about 7 housing developments were financed through the Strong Families Fund. And anecdotally, what we know is that all those projects closed before the pandemic. And anecdotally, what we know is that those families weathered the pandemic different. There was already in place social service coordination happening in the housing developments. And because that those resident service coordinators were already there and could direct families to where to get support for broadband, how to, make an unemployment claim, how to, pursue PPP for your small business. Those families had the in-place support going into the pandemic that helped them to come out of it hopefully a little bit stronger.
So this concept of healthy or vital community, obviously housing is very important because it provides stability for families. Families that are not stable, children have a hard time getting a good education, particularly if the family moves around or becomes homeless. And so without a good education, you have another negative social determinant that's going to have impact for years. Access to a livelihood that pays a living wage is absolutely important. And so the ability to fund businesses that can employ neighborhood residents, all those components are part of the community development finance system. I think part of this concept of attacking the social determinants early on so that different outcomes can occur over time. So I just think it's amazing that Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is so involved in this, and it's such a large foundation that has the capacity to really use its endowment, its balance sheet, if you will, in creative ways. So you talk a little bit about pay-for-performance financing, but could you explain a little bit more for our listeners what exactly that model is and how it's best used in impact investing world?
So pay-for-performance started to really come to the forefront, I think about in 2011. And at that time, I can remember attending a meeting and there was a euphoria that it was going to this new structure where you paid for outcomes and not just service delivery was really going to revolutionize the way that we delivered social services. And I think with a lot of ideas, you got to start somewhere, and the 1.0 version often needs refinement. And what I think we saw in the early days of pay for performance is that not everything worked. Pay for performance really demands having a very measurable outcome. It demands when you're selling that outcome to an investor, it really requires that you be very clear on who on the other side of the transaction is enjoying the benefit of the savings. So one example is that early childhood. So early childhood, the data tells us, can have lifelong benefits for children, and as such, also deliver lifelong savings to many different systems, the educational system, the housing system, the healthcare system, the correctional system. But it is a splintered benefit that actually accrues over years. And it's one example of what has made pay for performance somewhat challenging, is that it is not always a direct correlation between service delivery and savings on the other side. But I think what it has done over the years is really spark a conversation about outcomes that we want, and the value of those outcomes to the public sector. And so what we've seen, I'd say over the last 5 years, led by firms like Social Finance and Make Home Capital, is really kind of the next generation of pay-for-performance structures. And I do continue to think that in certain sectors, it is going to continue to be a very important part of the conversation, because everybody wants to pay for things that are working. And we do know that there is a lot of service delivery that we pay for that unfortunately does not have us have the intended outcomes either for the individual or the system. And so this is it's a different way to create a way to fund social services. I think, what we have to be careful about is to not overburden who are often nonprofit service deliverers and put the weight of the financial burden on their shoulders. And I think, unfortunately, that happened in some of the early transactions. But I am really pleased to see how the set of transactions has really evolved. And people have been very, very thoughtful about the learning and evaluation part of this work, which is informing kind of the next generation of the transactions.
I'd like you to help us think about what's ahead in this whole field of impact investing, particularly in the context of the significant amount of money now that has been authorized by Congress for a variety of things, whether it be the state small business credit initiative, which is $10 billion, or most recently, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which the EPA just announced a huge set of grants or allocations to a number of organizations, including many consortia of CDFIs, to work in low-income communities to improve the climate, to reduce carbon emissions, and so forth. What is the role of impact investing in conjunction with these large federal initiatives that are coming?
Myself and many others are still pinching ourselves at the volume of the money that this administration has committed, not just to climate, but to climate with a very specific focus on disadvantaged communities. I think it's an interesting question about the role of philanthropy at a time when there is, vast amounts of money coming from the federal government. And I think what I would say is this. When communities have been disinvested for generations, it often takes more than money. And when we think about getting capital to go the last mile, you can't just come with the capital. You have to come with the technical assistance to really ready that community in order to take advantage of it. And so an example that I would give is some work that we have been doing on water infrastructure. So shockingly, in this country, 2.3 million people, about the size of the city of Houston, don't enjoy running water at home. I mean, it's really unbelievable that happens here in the United States of America. And our water infrastructure, which is obviously highly correlated to health outcomes and economic prosperity, is really under duress. We worked with a CDFI in Texas because one of the things that we were hearing is that despite a huge amount of available public money coming from the federal government, that many smaller communities and disinvested communities still weren't taking advantage of it. And we wanted to understand why. And the reality is that in a lot of those communities, the mayor, the bus driver, and the director of public works is sometimes the same person. And they simply don't have the capacity or the technical know-how to really understand how to access those funds. And sometimes, in the case of water infrastructure, there also are upfront costs, in terms of engineering and legal and surveying that have to be attended to before you can apply for funds. And so working with Communities Unlimited, we stood up a pre-development fund that really took the very technical and hands-on expertise that CU had in financing water infrastructure and the trust that they had, even more importantly, the trust that they had in communities, and went out and said, community X, Y, and Z, we can make you a small loan to pay for these costs and somebody to work with you to kind of help you prepare this application, which gets you to the starting line to apply for these federal funds. I think we all remember, the term kind of shovel ready, the desire for shovel ready projects. And the truth is that not everything is shovel ready. It's not that it's not shovel worthy, as I've learned the better term is, which is, where should we be making those investments? But those communities just aren't yet ready. And how do we get them ready? And so I think, in this really historic time of federal investment, I think the real challenge for community development is how do we get communities ready? How do we create an investable pipeline? And, some really stellar work has been done by the Center for Community Investment, led by Robin Hackey, really on codifying, which I think are things that are relatively self-evident. But when you put them all on paper, that you have to bring more than capital, that a community really needs to articulate their priorities, shared priorities across the community level, at the public sector level, those who, are conduits for capital. You need to be very specific about what you're trying to finance. You need to really attack what is it going to take to create an investable pipeline, and then you need to be dogged in terms of that pursuit. None of that is rocket science, but making that happen in communities that have, again, a history of disinvestment, low on capacity, can be very, very hard without that very kind of intentional approach. And I think that's really the next challenge. And I would just end by saying it is absolutely maybe the most important thing in my mind that these federal dollars go far and wide through red, blue, and purple states. We have to make sure that the federal investment is seen and felt at the community level all across America. And that's going to take a lot of work to make all those dollars really felt at the neighborhood level.
Absolutely. And I guess I'd like to just tag on to something. You brought up Robin Hackey. Robin has been a great thought leader on this whole concept, particularly with, I think the term she uses, the capital absorption. If the capital is there, but the capacity, either a community or in a CDFI or in other organizations that's receiving the capital, doesn't have the capacity to really deploy it. It needs to add people. It needs to add systems in order to grow to that next level. Then you have a blockage that makes the whole system inefficient, maybe to say the least. And so the role that foundations can play with these organizations is to help them with the growth and the challenge of growth that comes when you have to deliver large amounts of capital. And so I'm editorializing here a little bit, but maybe you have some thoughts about that as well. Just beyond the investment, I'm talking about grant making now, and I'm talking about get systems in place that bring efficiencies. Would you look at the current buzz about AI and the role that's going to be playing very quickly in helping businesses become much more efficient? How do we get responsible AI into the hands of people running CDFIs and nonprofit delivery systems and so forth? Those are all front-end costs and difficult for organizations. Even if they're getting a lot of capital, it's difficult for that capital to be used for those improvements. Do you have any thoughts on that?
What I would say, again, kind of going back to some extraordinary grant making that I saw in the city of Detroit, is I have seen really tremendous philanthropy when grant makers really have both kind of the contextual knowledge of the problem and a mindset of capital allocation. Not everything is investable. And I think it's important, to remember that. But when we think about really looking at complex problems from take the GGRF, we need to really understand, and you have pointed out some examples, what is the GGRF not paying for? And where are those pockets, or are they geographies, or is it capacity, or is it credit enhancement that aren't going to fully allow that incredible public investment to be fully realized? Another kind of age-old example from my Rolodex, when the CDFI bond guarantee was first coming out, because of the very restricted language that came with the CDFI bond guarantee program, one of the assets that they had a really hard time dealing with was single-family mortgages. And we worked with a CDFI that really wanted to use the bond guarantee program for that asset class. But because we couldn't quite figure out how to use the treasury funds yet for it, what we ended up doing was structuring a guarantee that essentially absolved treasury of that risk on a demonstration portfolio of single-family assets, and then allowed for a period of time where those assets could be watched and monitored from a performance standpoint. And exactly what we thought would happen and wanted to have happen did happen, which is the assets performed just fine. And the Treasury Department had a proof point, and they could then go on and kind of include that as an eligible use for that program. And it's an example of, even the best intentioned public policy sometimes is going to have gaps. And I think where philanthropy, guided often by field practitioners, can be really helpful is in pinpointing exactly what those gaps are and then using grants or impact investments to fill them where appropriate.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that example up, because I think CREF was the issuer of those bonds for that program. And we've been fortunate as an organization, I should say they now, since I'm no longer employed by them, to be a very large issuer of, I think, more than $1 billion worth of these bonds that really have helped many CDFIs increase their capacity with their balance sheets to put money out in a variety of sectors, including affordable housing, now single-family housing, a small business, and a whole range of other human service activities. You've just kind of bowl around another example of how the public-private, nonprofit, and philanthropic sectors can work together to make something happen at no cost to the federal government.
But I do think the examples that you gave, Frank, make me think of one thing as it relates to GGRF. The first go-around with any of these programs is ugly. I mean, think about when New Markets first came out. It was so complex. People thought, oh, we'll never quite figure this out, right? It took time to figure out how to make that credit, workable and efficient for intermediaries and to really kind of deliver impact on the ground. CDFI bond guarantee program, the same thing. The CIGP, the same thing. GGRF, it's going to be the same thing. So I think it just, it's hopefully a little bit of tonic to all of us that, sometimes the first iteration, like the first batch of cookies that you make, they look kind of ugly. But over time, people, when we work together, when we really leverage the resources of field practitioners like yourself and CRF and philanthropy and community members, ultimately we really create something that is real value add for communities.
Yes, it is a continuous improvement, and you have to start somewhere. I think the exciting thing to me about innovation is you never know if it's going to work, but if you have the vision and the tenacity, oftentimes you can make sure something works. Or, as people would say, if you fail forward, learn from the experience, and then come back the next iteration, and it's going to work better. And I think what you're describing is this concept of initially there might be some failures, or there might be some less than perfect outcomes, but you learn from those outcomes and keep moving ahead. So it's an exciting time, I think, to be in our field, particularly with the interplay between community development and dealing with climate change and greenhouse gas reductions. It's imperative that we do this, and it's imperative that it be done in an equitable way across all of our communities, including low-income communities and neighborhoods. Well, I really appreciate the time you've taken to walk us through impact investing and the role of guarantees and pay for performance and other innovations, and your work at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So I really want to thank you, Kimberlee, and wish you the best going forward, and look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been great chatting with you.
And that wraps up this episode of A New Capitalism. Hope you found value in this discussion as we continue exploring how to build a new and more equitable capitalism. If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming conversations with innovative leaders driving positive change. Thanks for tuning in. We look forward to having you join us again next time.
This has been A New Capitalism with Frank Altman. If you'd like to connect with Frank and join the movement to create a new capitalism that works for all, go to frankaltman.com. Frank's book is available on print, audio, and ebook formats on all major book-selling sites. A New Capitalism is a production of Forbes Books.